Let me focus your attention this morning, one last time, on the book of James. This is the final week. This is a wrap-up sermon. I'm going to read James chapter 4, the first few verses. We're going to be looking at a number of different passages in James and some passages outside James. I want to spend just our short time together talking, or at least sharing with you some of the things that I have learned during the course of our walk through this particular book, because this has been such a crucial series for me. God has shown me so many things, and I wanted to share some of those with you. But James writes, "What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. You adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God." And my hope and my prayer is that as we spend some time together this morning reflecting on the things we've learned as we've made our way through this remarkable book, that God would set us free in brand new, bright, and liberating ways. I wanted to spend one last week just simply reflecting on some of the things God has taught me, some of the ways God has reoriented my heart and my mind around the radical nature of the gospel as a result of making our way through this remarkable book. And so there are really three things in particular that I wanted to share with you, things that I learned both as we made our way through James, but also not only things that I learned making our way through James, but there are things that I learned outside of the book of James that the book of James pushed me toward. And so we're going to look at a couple of different passages in James, but we're also going to look at a couple of different passages outside James as an overall reflection on what I hope we take away from this 14-week study. I remember when I announced that we were going to be making our way through the book of James, I encouragingly heard from a number of people who were very happy about the fact that we were going to be making our way through the book of James, because, as they said, James really gets down to brass tacks and tells us what to do. And as encouraging as that may seem on the surface, ironically, believe it or not, that concerned me. And I'll tell you why. Because one of the chief lessons I've learned, and it's so ironic that I would learn this making our way through the book of James, which is a book that deals primarily with what we are to do. And it's as we've made our way through this book that I've come to the fresh realization that doing is not what Christianity is about. Because the gospel really is, and this is so important for us to understand, the gospel is for tired receivers, not triumphant achievers. Big difference. It's very important for us to be clear with regard to what the gospel actually is. The gospel, the word gospel, literally means good news. In fact, the New Testament word for evangelist, as I've mentioned before, is simply a word that points back to someone who would come back from a victory on the battlefield and announce that the victory had been secured. And so the gospel is not a command for us to do anything at all. It's an announcement of what has already been done. It's a declaration of victory. And it's important, as I've made my way through this book through this letter, it helped me realize that the gospel is first for tired receivers, not for triumphant achievers. We are, without question, a society of doers. In 1,000 different ways, we're told that accomplishment precedes acceptance, that achievement precedes approval. And we are told that from 1,000 different places, from 1,000 different angles. We are encouraged to do if we are ever going to become someone of importance. And since we all long for affirmation and validation, we set out to prove our worth by working. Our culture is obsessed with practicality and doing, obsessed with it. They're much more obsessed with achieving than receiving. They're much more obsessed with working than resting. Our culture's obsession with practicality and doing comes from our longing to be approved. And what happens inside the church is that we take this unwittingly into our relationship with God. So look at this famous account in Luke chapter 10. This is an account that I go back to time and time again, some paradigm-shattering sentences here. In this account, it's the famous account of Martha and Mary, Luke chapter 10, verse 38. It says, "Now as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving." That sentence is underlined in my Bible. An amazing contrast is taking place here. You have one sitting at the feet of Jesus, fixing her eyes on the author and perfecter of her faith, resting. Her work was resting. And you have Martha, on the other hand, who was taken up with much serving. And it says, as a result, she was distracted. Keep going. "And she went up to him," Martha did, "and said, 'Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me.'" Verse 41, "But the Lord answered her, 'Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary.'" This is going to be good. Here's Jesus, second person of the Godhead, getting ready to tell us that one thing is necessary. Here it is. "Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her." This goes against everything we grow up in America believing. I mean, we are told to work, 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 work. Now, I'm not saying do nothing, okay? I'm saying when it comes specifically to our relationship with God, receiving precedes achieving. Resting precedes working. In fact, we will quickly run out of gas. We will quickly run out of steam in our doing if our hearts and our minds are not first soaking in what's been done. Here we have this remarkable picture, this unbelievable picture of Mary sitting at the feet of Jesus, resting, listening, not being distracted by the 1,000 things around her. And her sister, on the other hand, remarkably distracted with much serving. It's amazing to me how in our culture, specifically inside the church, we can equate busyness with godliness. I've said this on numerous occasions, but it's so fascinating to me when I see a brand new, liberated Christian come into the company of God's people in a local church, and they're excited, they're thrilled about their newfound freedom, and it's not long before their smile turns into a look of absolute panic, because we are so astute inside the church of laying on top of their shoulders a morass of things they must do if they're really going to be serious Christians. It's unbelievable to me, okay? It's unbelievable. I mean, it's as if we look at this story from Luke and turn it upside down and show these people that if you're really serious about God, if you really love Jesus, then you will do. And what Jesus says, in contrast to that, is when you rest and receive, that is the good thing. That is the portion that can never be stripped away. And so one of my concerns as an individual living in the modern world and for this church is that we would never conclude that busyness equals godliness, that we would learn to rest in and receive the finished work of Christ, that we would rejoice and relax under the banner which reads, "It is finished." And in that sense, we would resist the world, the flesh, and the devil, which is trying always to convince us that the more we do, the happier God will be with us. We've concluded, ironically, that Christianity is primarily a lifestyle, that the essence of our faith centers on how to live and what we do. The question, what do I do, becomes the driving force more than what has Jesus done. Our ongoing performance for Jesus, not Jesus' finished performance for us, is the primary focus of sermons and books and conferences. I mean, sermons in our day become nothing more and nothing less than to-do lists, catering to the cultural climate in which we live in. I mean, on the one hand, I was encouraged that when I heard people inside this church saying, "We're so glad we're going to study the book of James," I was happy, I was encouraged, because there's thirst for God's word and God's truth in a statement like that. But when we quickly come to the conclusion that just tell us what to do, we just want to know what to do, be practical, okay? When that becomes the driving force, tell us what to do instead of sit back, relax, rejoice, revel in, it is finished. That is what Jesus commends. And ironically, it's as I've made my way through this book and understood it within the larger context of the Bible as a whole, and what the gospel shouts, I've come to the realization that doing is not first what Christianity is all about. Now, don't get me wrong, the Christian life involves hard work, but the hard work isn't what you think it is. Okay, it's not personal improvement. It's amazing to me how we can take this grand announcement that it is finished and turn it into a narcissistic program of self-improvement. It's amazing to me. I do it all the time. The Bible becomes nothing more and nothing less than a collection of timeless principles that, if applied, will give us our best life now. Unbelievable, okay? Listen, the Bible, the story, capital S story of the Bible, has nothing to do with you and me at all. It has everything to do with Christ. It is, as Jesus said himself, as he was walking on the road to Emmaus with his disciples, speaking at that point of the Old Testament. The entire Bible speaks about me. It tells the story of me. It develops the promise that God himself made in the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapter 3, that the seed of the woman would come and crush the head of the serpent. And the rest of the Bible tells that story, develops that story, unveils that story. The Bible's about Jesus and what he's done. It's not a collection of timeless principles that, if applied, will, as I said, give us our best life now. It's not the Bible. Okay, and oftentimes we read it that way. I read it that way. And James is a very tempting book to read that way. But we miss it. We miss it altogether. The hard work, and James points this out. He points this out in some remarkable ways in this chapter. The hard work is washing your hands of you and resting in Christ's finished work for you. That's the work. Yes, it is. The Christian faith requires effort, but it's not the kind of effort that we automatically think it is. It's the effort of resting and receiving, which is something you and I do not do naturally. Okay, we are, since the Garden of Eden, remarkably astute at securing for ourselves the justification, trying anyway, to secure for ourselves the justification and the rescue and the approval and all of those things that we long for. Self-justification, self-actualization is something that by nature we are prone to do. The gospel is so counterintuitive in that regard because it says receive. It's finished. And that is so painful for us. That's why my friend Mike Horton titled one of the chapters in his book, The Gospel-Driven Life, great book by the way, titled one of his chapters, Don't Just Do Something, Sit There. It was an exhortation to us busy Christians to simply receive. Receive Christ's "it is finished" into our rebellious regions of unbelief. I read this story last night, written by a doctor named Richard Selzer, who describes a scene in a hospital room after he performed surgery on a young woman's face. It's a remarkable story. He writes, "I stand by the bed where the young woman lies, her face post-operative, her mouth twisted in palsy clownish. A tiny twig of the facial nerve, one of the muscles of her mouth, has been severed. She will be that way from now on. I had followed with religious fervor the curve of her flesh, I promise you that. Nevertheless, to remove the tumor in her cheek, I had cut this little nerve. Her young husband is in the room. He stands on the opposite side of the bed, and together they seem to be in a world all their own in the evening lamplight, isolated from me, private. Who are they? I ask myself. He and this wry mouth I have made, who gaze at and touch each other so generously. The young woman speaks. Will my mouth always be like this? She asks. Yes, I say, it will. It's because the nerve was cut. She nods and is silent, but the young man smiles. I like it, he says. It's kind of cute. All at once I know who he is. I understand and I lower my gaze. One is not bold in an encounter with the divine. Unmindful, he bends to kiss her crooked mouth, and I am so close, I can see how he twists his own lips to accommodate to hers, to show her that their kiss still works. This is Jesus. Okay, this is Christianity. The Christian faith is not first and foremost about our doing. It's about what Christ has done, and he invites us to rest in that. It's not first and foremost about cleaning ourselves up and getting better and self-improvement. It's not about us at all. It's about Jesus who wraps himself like this husband around our brokenness and our ugly, ever-present sin. That's who he is. He doesn't ask us to clean ourselves up before he loves us. He doesn't ask us to beautify ourselves before he sheds his affection on us and kisses us. That's not the Jesus we serve. We're far more messed up than we realize. Our faces and our hearts are far more contorted than we could ever imagine. And this tender kiss from our Savior, who took on human flesh and frailty, who bent his lips so that the kiss with sinful humanity would work. That's what our faith is about. It's about what he's done. It's not about our activity. It's about his humility. It's not about our ascension to something great. It's about his descension to something frail and fragile like human flesh. That's what our faith is about. Every behavioral exhortation that James gives in this letter, I went back through it again yesterday just to make sure I wasn't making this up. Every behavioral exhortation he gives, whether he's talking about the way we speak, the way we use our money, favoritism, pride, patience and suffering, he gives 59 commands in this book, and every single one, every behavioral exhortation James gives has to do with forgetting about yourself. That's at the heart of what he's exhorting us to do. Forget about yourself. It's when we refuse to forget about ourselves. It's when we become the center of our own attention and we engage in what I call spiritualized navel gazing, where we become fixated and obsessed with how we're doing. When that happens, then we become guilty of all of these things James exhorts us against. It's the sin underneath the sin. Every behavioral exhortation he gives has to do with forgetting about yourself and the way you look and trusting in the sufficiency of God's grace. I mean, in the verses that I read in chapter 4, verses 1 to 3, he actually defines worldliness in terms of self-absorption. We tend to think of worldliness, when Christians think of the term worldliness, we tend to think about it in terms of bad behavior. And James redefines it here. I mean, this is how he describes worldliness. Worldliness is a my life for me approach to life. I mean, it's self-absorption. Self-absorption for Christians is what I call Christian narcissism. It's under the guise of our pursuit of holiness or our practice of godliness or whatever other title we want to give it, we become obsessed with our spiritual progress. And as I've said on numerous occasions, it wasn't until Peter took his eyes off Christ and focused on his performance that he started to sink when walking on water. We think it's a noble thing. We think it's a good thing. We think it's a mark of spiritual maturity to be obsessed with how we're doing. And yet, James says, obsession with yourself is what leads to all other sin. Every exhortation he gives has at the root a forgetting about ourselves. An blessed self-forgetfulness, as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago. Sanctification, listen. Sanctification, this is the best definition of sanctification that I can give. It's simple. Sanctification is simply getting used to your justification. That's it. Okay? Sanctification is a big theological word for Christian growth. Sanctification is simply getting used to your justification. It's going back to the reality of your already secured pardon and hitting the refresh button 1,000 times a day. That's the hard work that we're called to engage in. Going forward requires a daily going backwards. Which is why Martin Luther said, and he's right, as he often is, Martin Luther said, to be convinced in our hearts that we have forgiveness of sins and peace with God by grace alone is the hardest thing. Is the Christian life hard? Yes! What's the hardest thing about it? What Luther just said. What's the hardest thing about the Christian life? Receiving our already secured pardon and resting and rejoicing. That's the hard part. That doesn't come naturally to me. Jenna was telling me the other day about some problem she had in school with another student, and she was very upset about this. Okay, she doesn't have too many problems, but she just bawling about this problem she had with this girl, and I felt so bad for her, and I want her to know that her dad's on her side, so I said, honey, tell me what the problem is. I fix problems, okay? Now, I'm not going to go do anything to this little girl and her family, okay? So don't walk out of here thinking I just wanted her to know that Dad's got your back. But it was so funny because even as I said it, I'm thinking, that's what we typically do. We fix problems. We find our sense of importance and meaning and worth and significance in fixing things. And so we become busy with remarkable activity. And as a result, we become enslaved to our busyness. The real question is, as I mentioned about 6 weeks ago, this is the real question. What are you going to do now that you don't have to do anything? That is the question that we get up every morning to as Christian people. Everything's been done. It is finished. It's secured. It's a done deal. So what are you going to do now that you don't have to do anything? What will your life look like lived under the banner which reads, "It is finished"? That's the question. No longer do we have to try and impress God and justify ourselves and clean ourselves up and rescue ourselves and, all of those things. It's done. It's finished. It's a done deal. We're just waiting. We're just waiting and crying out, "Maranatha, come Lord Jesus, come quickly." But we're waiting. And in the process of waiting, we're continually receiving what Christ has already secured for us. The real question is, what is your life going to look like now that you don't have to do anything? Okay, so that's the first thing, ironically, going through James that I've learned, that doing is not what Christianity is about. It's not. The second thing that I've learned, and this is another ironic lesson I learned studying this book, our rescue is objective. Now, I'm going to explain that in a second, but it's very tempting to go through the book of James and to look at these things, these truths in James as a set of timeless principles that we simply apply in our lives, and as a result, we can start feeling better about ourselves. It's really the goal, isn't it? That's the goal. I mean, we have a remarkable tendency to use Jesus to help us feel better about ourselves, as if feeling better about ourselves is the ultimate goal. We do this very subtly, by the way. I do it. You do it. We all do it. And so what happens is we tend to conclude that our rescue, our freedom, our salvation is primarily dependent on how we're doing. It's subjective. We look inside to find the assurance that we crave. It's very tempting to do that when you make your way through a book like James, but I learned as we've studied this book that our rescue is objective. It is something that has happened outside of us. Now let me just sort of unpack this practically and hope that this sets you free the way it set me free. When you're on the brink of despair, you're going through a difficult season in life, you're experiencing what the Puritans used to call a dark night of the soul, turning to the internal quality of your faith will bring you no hope. Every internal answer will collapse underneath you. Turning to the external object of your faith, namely Christ and his finished work on your behalf, is the only place to find peace and help. A couple weeks ago, I was in Chicago for a big conference, and Tim Keller was one of the preachers, and he preached a remarkable sermon through Exodus chapter 14, which is the account of the children of Israel crossing through the Red Sea. And he described this picture, great picture. He said, you can just imagine, okay, this huge body of water separated. On either side, you have, this wall of water, 2.5 million people, not including, cattle and herds and that sort of thing, are making their way through. And he said, you can just imagine of 2.5 million people, some people are walking through with great confidence going, we're gonna make it. God's in charge. We're gonna make it. Other people are walking through going, we're gonna die, we're gonna die, we're gonna die, we're gonna die. Any second now, we're gonna die. This is crazy, okay? And his point was, God saved them both. The quality of our faith doesn't save us and doesn't provide you and me with the assurance that we long for and crave. It's the object of our faith. It's the object of our faith, the external object of our faith, not the internal quality of our faith, which gives us hope and security and peace in times of doubt and despair and desperation. The gospel always directs you to something, to someone outside of you instead of to something inside of you for the assurance that you crave and need. I like the way Sinclair Ferguson put it. He wrote, true faith takes its character and quality from its object and not from itself. Faith gets a man out of himself and into Christ. Its strength, therefore, depends on Christ's character. Even those of us who have weak faith have the same strong Christ as others. That's where we find our hope and our security and our help. When everything around us seems to be falling apart. And the book of James, because it gives us so many commands and tells us so many different things to do in light of what Christ has done, it's very easy to turn this book into a manual that can help us feel better about ourselves so that we can stand firm when things get rough in our lives. If we do that, we'll be washed away. Because it's not the internal quality of our faith. It's the external object of our faith which gives us help. Romans chapter 5, verse 1, Paul writes, therefore, since we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Listen, this is real, bona fide peace. Not the kind of false peace that our culture's selling or the temporary peace that we try so hard to secure for ourselves in difficult seasons. This is real, long-lasting, bona fide peace that's built on a real change in status before God. That's what Paul's talking about. Where does this peace come from? Does it come from the internal quality of our faith? Does internal peace come from how well we're doing and how good we're becoming? That's not at all where it comes from. Paul says it comes from a real change in status before God, from standing guilty before God the judge to standing righteous before God our Father. This is the objective custody of even the weakest believer. It's done. The gospel is the good news announcing Christ's devotion to us, not our devotion to him. So often we try to find peace. I try to find peace by examining my devotion to Jesus. And it's no wonder that I emerge from that examination discouraged, depressed. I can't rescue myself. No matter how hard I try, the only way I will ever be able to feel better about myself is if I deceive myself. Because the deeper I look, the scarier it gets. Okay? You too, by the way. I know. I hope you're clapping not because you... Are you clapping because you know that's true about me? Okay? It is true. I'm not hiding anything. This is the objective custody of even the weakest believer. Listen, the gospel is not a command to hang on to Jesus. It's good news. Because try as you may, you will let go. You will. You will. Some of you are in a season where you've let go right now. You're on the verge of quitting altogether. Listen, the gospel is not a command to hang on to Jesus. It's a promise that no matter how weak your faith may be, God is always holding on to you. Always. It is an announcement that Christ is infinitely devoted to us, that he infinitely loves us. It announces that Christ has accomplished work on behalf of sinners like you and me. This peace that Paul talks about in Romans chapter 5 is a peace that rests squarely on the fact that we've already been, as he goes on to say, reconciled to God by the death of his Son, justified before God once and for all through faith in Christ's finished work. Now that will, okay, make no mistake about it, that will surely produce real feelings and robust action. But this peace with God that Paul describes rests squarely on the work of Christ for us, outside of us. It's objective, and that's a hard thing for us to swallow in our highly subjective culture, where it's all about how I feel. And man, if you bank on your peace and your security on the way that you feel, on something inside of you, you'll give up and give in. But when you can turn to that man's cross and that man's blood and that man's death and that man's resurrection, you can experience the peace that transcends all understanding. That is the objective custody of even the weakest believer. Because the truth is, the more I look into my own heart and to my own performance for peace, the less I find. And the more I look to Christ and his promises for peace, the more I find. Okay, last lesson that I learned. Not only did I learn that our rescue is objective, that Christianity is not first about doing, but I also learned that true spirituality is not introverted, but extroverted. What I mean by that is we tend to think of spirituality, anything that is termed spirituality today has to do with internal improvement. It has to do with the individual experience, internal experience of the believer, whatever that may be. But the way James describes true spirituality is not introverted, it's extroverted. In other words, it doesn't take us deeper in, it sends us further out. He says this in chapter 1, verse 27, and chapter 2, verses 15 and 16. He makes it clear that true spirituality takes us away from ourselves and into the messy lives of other people. That's real spirituality. Real spirituality, true spirituality, doesn't curve us in, it sends us out. It's not about private spirituality, it's about public service. That's the illustrations that James gives here. When he talks about real, robust religion, chapter 1, in verse 27, is the only place in the whole Bible where the word religion is used positively. Everywhere else it's used negatively. It usually refers to works righteousness. But here, James uses it and says, in a positive way, religion that is pure and undefiled before God, the Father, is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Okay? Now, what does true spirituality, worthwhile religion look like, according to James? Public service. Forgetting about ourselves completely and entering into the messy lives of other people who need help. As I've said, Luther said, God doesn't need your good works, but your neighbor does. Okay? I mean, that is the summation of this entire book. God does not need your good. We tend to think of Christian maturity and true spirituality in terms of individual, internal improvement. Listen, the only way you will internally improve is if you completely forget about yourself and go serve someone. Okay, that's it. That's what he's saying here. I mean, everything, as I mentioned, everything he speaks against has as its root self-absorption. It's about us. It's about me. I am beginning to realize that the sin I need removed daily is my narcissistic obsession with my own spiritual progress. It's amazing. I mean, I think too much about how I'm doing, if I'm growing, whether I'm doing it right or not. I spend too much time pondering my failure and brooding over my spiritual successes. In other words, I spend too much time, way too much time, thinking about me and what I need to do, and far too little time thinking about what Jesus has already done. And what I've discovered is that the more I focus on my need to get better, the worse I actually get. It's ironic. I become neurotic and self-absorbed. There are so many neurotic Christians in the church today. Neurotic. Okay, you're one of them. So am I. When we fixate on our performance, when that becomes true spirituality for us, when it becomes introverted, we become spiritualized navel-gazers, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, and we actually get worse. Listen, I said this 2 weeks ago. This has absolutely changed the way that I think, thanks to this book. When we stop narcissistically focusing on our need to get better, that is what it means to get better. When we stop obsessing over our need to improve, that is what it means to improve. Because when we do this, I mean, preoccupation with my performance over Christ's performance for me makes me increasingly self-centered and morbidly introspective. And when we do this, we fail to see the needs of our neighbor and serve them. Luther described sin. He defined sin as humanity curved in on itself. And he saw salvation and rescue from God as being sending man out, not in, washing his hands of himself. There's nothing about the gospel that encourages me to fix my eyes on me. Nothing. In fact, any version of Christianity that encourages you to think mostly about you is detrimental to your faith, whether it's your failures or your successes, your good works or your bad works, your strengths or your weaknesses, your obedience or your disobedience. Any version of Christianity that encourages you to think mostly about you is detrimental to your faith. The gospel causes us to look up to Christ and what he did, out to our neighbor and what they need, not into ourselves and how we're doing. That's what the gospel does. It causes us to look up to Christ and what he did, out to our neighbor and what they need, not into ourselves and how we're doing. The The gospel declares that Jesus has done everything for us. He's paid it all. It is finished. If you're a Christian, I have a friend, professor out in California, named Rod Rosenblatt, this is the way he signs his letters to me. He's almost 70 years old. This is the way he signs his letters to me. You are right now under the completely sufficient imputed righteousness of Christ. What a great reminder. If you're a Christian, you are under the completely sufficient imputed righteousness of Christ. You already have an A. The threat of failure, judgment, and condemnation has been removed. You're in forever. Nothing you do will make your grade better, and nothing you do will make your grade worse. And what this does, what the gospel does, is it relieves us of the pressure to do anything for Jesus, because he doesn't need anything from us. And that alone frees us to do everything for others. And that's what James is pushing us to do. He's pushing us out. He's pushing us out, not in. Let me just read this in conclusion. This comes from C.S. Lewis's children's book, Voyage of the Dawn Treader. If you're familiar with the story, you'll know that there is a pouting, spoiled, self-centered boy named Eustace. Okay? Just annoying little kid. And he's the cousin of the stars of the show. And every time I read about him, or when I saw him in the movie, he makes me smile and squirm because he reminds me of me. And you. He reminds me of you too. He reminds me of all of us. In fact, Voyage of the Dawn Treader really is Eustace's story and mine and yours. It's about how a human soul can descend to monstrous depths and then find unexpected and undeserved redemption through one who alone can change us. Okay, so this is what happens at a time in the story. On an island where Eustace is supposed to be helping the mission at hand, he instead sneaks off and finds a dragon's lair. If you're familiar with the story, you know the part. And there he is fed by his greed. He's a completely spoiled, self-absorbed little kid, and he's fed by his greed for the hoard of treasure that is there. And as a result, Eustace is transformed into a dragon. Okay? He goes from being a little boy to a dragon, and at first he loves it. He relishes the power of being big and strong and being able to breathe fire and fly and all of those things. At first he relishes the power, but soon isolation and shame make him realize the truth that he is an intolerable monster and nobody wants to be around him. He begins to want to change. Well, that night, Aslan comes to Eustace and he tells him to undress, in Lewis's words, out of his dragonness. And Eustace tries to scratch at his skin, and at first it seems to work because scales slip off like a banana peel. But just as soon as one layer comes off, Eustace discovers that another layer of dragon skin lies beneath the first. And in despair, Eustace realizes that he can't cure himself. He isn't merely wearing a dragon suit, he is a dragon. And he goes on to describe what happens next. Then Aslan said, "You will have to let me undress you." Eustace said, "I was afraid of his claws, but I can tell you I was pretty nearly desperate now. So I just lay flat down on my back to let him do it. That very first tear he made was so deep that I thought it had gone right into my heart. And when he began pulling the skin off, it hurt worse than anything I'd ever felt. The only thing that made me able to bear it was just the pleasure of feeling the stuff peel off." Listen, I tell you that story at the conclusion of this series because transformation happens only when I recognize that I cannot change my skin. There is no self-help. There is no extreme soul makeover. I can never cure myself. It's only when I surrender to the one who rips deep the fibers of my dragonness that I can ever hope to be free. We're not sinners because we sin because we're sinners. We don't just look like dragons, we are. And it takes Christians, it takes sinners laying on their back and letting Aslan tear. It's not doing anything. It's what is done. It's sitting back and letting him tear the flesh off. And it hurts. Jesus likened the process of transformation to the gouging out of our eye or the cutting off of our hand. At first, it's going to feel like we're parting with something we can't do without. But as he keeps ripping and we become increasingly free, we recognize that real transformation comes as a result of receiving, not achieving. And that's why we gather together around the Lord's Supper as Christian people. We come not to bring anything, but to receive everything. We come because we recognize that in the person of Jesus, God has done for sinners like me what I could never do for myself. That he has come to bring rescue and liberation and freedom. Jesus said, I've come to set the captives free. Captives, you and I are. And Jesus came to set us free. And when we gather around the Lord's table, that's what we celebrate. And it is a celebration.